Hello everyone. Dacha, Zol, Spliff joints. Yes, today we're talking about cannabis, but we're taking a slightly more counter kind of culture approach and focusing on the business side. Specifically, what this kind of means for the African people and how do we build a sustainable industry in Africa. After all, there are few crops as beneficial as cannabis. It can be used for food, for humans and animals, building materials, medicine, paper, and plastics. But guys, you know this, and the session really isn't about justifying the use of cannabis or, the various considerations around the use of cannabis. Today, I purely want to look into what the opportunity is and how South Africa can exploit it. Good. So when we really dive into the global market, in 2018, the global market was estimated at 344 billion US dollars. By the end of 2019, this had grown to 400 billion US dollars. That's a fairly big pie. And, it really begs the question, how does a developing economy take part in what is arguably the largest newly developed industry in decades? When we consider when we want to consider how South Africa should approach it, I think it's only prudent that we look at the opportunities and challenges that we face. Firstly, let's get it out of the way. Our sunny South Africa has a climate that allows, in many cases, for multiple crops per year. If you consider that the cannabis plant is one of the fastest growing plants used in agriculture, this presents a significant opportunity to generate biomass. But I think even more importantly is our advantage in terms of the cost of labor. If you consider the US farm worker labor cost of $12.77 per hour, the South African farm worker earning $1.10 American cents per hour is a significantly lower operating cost. In a market where really the most important metric is the cost of production, and the vast majority of that cost can be attributed to the labor cost, that is a significant advantage for our geography. And considering that delta presents a massive opportunity for us to improve the minimum wages that we offer workers in this industry considerably, while still maintaining a commercial advantage. On the challenge side, South Africa unfortunately has an enormous dependence on imported agrochemicals, with the latest stats citing 84% of our agrochemicals are imported. This brings with it the exposure to a volatile exchange rate, and this directly affects not only our cash crops, but also our food crops. If we can remove that dependence by producing inputs locally, I think that we can significantly alter the cost profile of producing cannabis, as well as stimulate additional industries within our country. We also, no one in South Africa would be a stranger to what we call load shedding. However, for those that don't know, South Africa suffers significant power outages as we try to manage a older power grid waiting for new capacity to come online. In the cannabis cultivation world, using some greenhouse and indoor technology, these automated systems are extremely dependent on a reliable source of power. And the creation of redundant forms to combat our unreliable power supply is hugely capital intensive, which pushes even more South Africans out of the market. Ideally, if we then consider that the climate that we discussed earlier, as well as that unreliable power, it's a clear leader for South Africa to focus on outdoor cultivation. To me, the 75% labor cost ratio is an absolute benefit, because we've got a vast unemployed population that requires gainful full-time employment. And due to that cost delta, I believe that it holds a huge opportunity for us. Where areas, the other cultivation approaches, either in greenhouse or indoor, are very capital intensive, and they try to do away with some of that labor requirement, due to the cost of labor and the geographies that use those methods. For us, I believe that the manual methods, or the more labor intensive methods, are ultimately the most sustainable for us. And then, my final concern, or in terms of the challenge, is that a lot of cannabis businesses that don't approach their operations with a sustainable moniker can ultimately do a lot of damage to the agricultural land. In much the same way as standard commercial agriculture does. The chemicals and pesticides used on non-organic crops do filter into the soil and can affect the health and fertility of the soil. So at Tetra Botanica, we started a proof of concept to ask some very specific questions about what regenerative cannabis is, and whether we can use these models to reduce the operational cost of commercial scale cannabis cultivation. Then we also needed to understand, is there an organic pesticide that really works for the industry, that's reliable enough, and then most importantly, does not affect the health of the consumer afterwards. And then the other consideration for our proof of concept was really around developing control systems that made sense for organic agriculture. While there are frameworks available, I do feel that a lot of those frameworks take best practice steps without considering the impact the cost of compliance may ultimately have on the business. So our proof of concept is really around understanding what South African cannabis operations look like, and how we can closely align to global standards while fighting our own share of challenges. The core outcomes we were hoping for, or the answers that we were hoping for, is we have to understand that as the global supply increases, producers will suffer price pressures. If South Africa already has an advantage in terms of its operational costs with regards to climate control, we have an advantage in terms of lower capital expenditure for startup, because we don't necessarily need the expensive greenhouse infrastructure. And if we can then further reduce our cost of operation with regenerative organic practices, we've cut the three most significant pieces of cost introduced into this process. And then, if we can lower the cost of commercial cannabis cultivation by embracing these regenerative agricultural practices, we ultimately create a climate-conscious advantage. And that advantage allows us to pivot our attention to uplifting local communities through small business partnerships and cooperation for supporting services. There are many services in the cannabis industry, which we'll touch on a bit later, that don't directly touch the plant, but will be fundamentally important in a successful industry. On the following slides, I've broken some challenges down, and I hope to kind of just explore these concepts with you in terms of what it means and what the impact is. So we mentioned earlier that South Africa has an enormous dependence on imported inputs. Now, we believe that regenerative probiotic farming practices can completely remove the need for cannabis cultivation. We proved this in our POC, where we ultimately used nothing but compost and gypsum as organic as inputs into the crop, and managed to deliver a successful yield. Further, these practices restore the soil to increase food crop production. Crop rotation is something that wide areas of the agricultural community do practice. However, the type of beneficial relationship that cannabis has with the soil enriches fertility and ensures that other crops, when rotated onto those lands, are planted in extremely fertile soil. Further, we can reduce the the cost of producing those food and cash crops with local inputs. For our proof of concept, we ultimately used, I've already mentioned gypsum, we used homemade compost, and we also used some kelp brought up from Hermanus, from a kelp farm, from a local kelp farm there. We also used alfalfa grass, which we sourced locally as a important plant growth stimulator. But further than that, we ultimately just used water. We made extensive use of top dressers and mulches to reduce the water requirements for those crops. And quite broadly, we expect to save around 75% of the well-documented 2 liter per plant per day averages that the consulting firms are guiding us with. We also have taken an approach of zero tillage. To those interested in organic cultivation, the crime of modern agriculture is ultimately the disturbance of the topsoil layer. Essentially, during the summer months when conditions are right, a whole host of soil microbes from fungi and bacteria take hold in the soil. And our traditional agricultural practices ultimately disrupt that very fundamental process in nature. Those soil microbes bind the soil together. They provide a protective layer that stops too much evaporation of water. When you combine that with mulch, these microbes can often survive through winter in a dormant state and then re-emerge when conditions are right. These microbes have been shown to be fundamental in the plant health response. And we've also definitely noted an increase in plant vigor on land that has been allowed to recover from years of tillage, where our POC was done in an old cornfield. It was left fallow for must have been a better part of 10 years, and all we did was add those minimal inputs, our seeds, and we managed to deliver a successful crop. These soil microbes and mulches also, retain the temperature of the soil. So you'll find that we're able to cultivate much later into the season because our root systems are being kept relatively warm by bacterial processes as well as the insulating layer that the mulches provide. And then lastly, these types of organic practices provide increased safety for farm workers because a lot of the pesticides used in commercial agricultural farming, use pesticides that I definitely wouldn't want to inhale, let alone consume in, potentially a medicine. So the intrusion prevention systems that we utilized on the farm, you've made use of indigenous fungal colonies that would control the various pests that we expected to see within cannabis. And admittedly, the organic pest control systems do require a bit of refinement, but we definitely saw strong successes from those solutions. And again, keeping with the theme, those products can be produced in country by licensed laboratories, an area where South Africa hasn't really invested in quite some time. So let's talk about social responsibility in the cannabis industry. Utilizing gains from the 3 areas that we've identified, one being the climate, another being the cost of labor, and lastly, those regenerative systems, we're ultimately left with a substantial or a high margin business that's able to change the lives of the people that work there and, many more. But some of the key social responsibilities that we hope to be able to prove with our model is to create jobs for women who lead households. We found statistics that mentioned that 41% of South African households are led by women. However, the domestic job market does not create equal opportunity. Cannabis is one of those industries that doesn't that allows or avails itself well to women in the workplace. and we see women doing extremely well in the industry globally. Our goal is to employ women that require the income to care for their families, where they may not have a the traditional two income family. We also hope to stimulate local business with investments in the industrial processing for the various other industrial applications of cannabis, predominantly being building materials and fuel. However, with time, we'd like to scale those operations in order to harvest hemp seed, which has 8 times higher omega-3 content than the average fish that you would buy from your local grocer. So that is a food crop both for human consumption as well as animal consumption. I think is critical, and we hope to develop systems to allow smaller scale farmers to cultivate cannabis outside of the medical constraints. A type of cannabis that doesn't necessarily have psychoactive value, but can be grown rather inexpensively, specifically for industrial use. Some will notice it as hemp, but if we take one step down, that might get a little complex. But further, the business aims to provide skills for organic subsistence and market farming. It broke my heart when South Africa went into lockdown during the COVID pandemic, seeing our people queue in the longest lines you can imagine in order to receive a food parcel. I believe that critical to the security of life in South Africa is the ability for people to be able to feed themselves. And I think key to that is maybe enabling people to grow their own food. And the goal for us is to run various community programs that enable not only our staff, but the community as a whole with the skills required to make their own fertilizer, to prepare their own gardens, and then ultimately the skills required to plan those gardens for multiple food crops in the same year. And then, at the same time, we will provide skills for the booming cannabis sector, and allow those people to seek gainful employment in this, what would arguably be one of South Africa's fastest growing industries. And then, as we move closer to legalization of this industry, while South Africa has taken the first couple of tentative steps and allowed us to apply for licensing, I feel that the scope is somewhat limited at the moment. And I just made some notes here on more granular policy that I think government needs to consider when implementing industry in South Africa. Number one is not to view cannabis as a foreign investment platform. The problem with that is simply that few people benefit from the cash injection granted by that foreign investment. The foreign party ultimately comes in, utilizes the land and perhaps some domestic labor. However, the trend has definitely been to bring labor along with those businesses into country. I believe that that gives away a large part of the cannabis value chain, and ideally, government should rather enable local business to run with this, and also to protect the smaller farmer. I do think that there's value in a discussion around limiting the total size or the total amount of a farm that can be used for cannabis cultivation. And this also helps to preserve the food crop balance. The last thing we need is a struggling population to drop their food production in favor of cash crops. So that type of regulation will ensure that we have stable food as well as a cash crop. Current licensing, as I said, was focused purely on medical, and while I understand that is the most valuable industry, I think long term we will see cannabis take over as an industrial crop for paper, plastics, as well as various building materials. I've illustrated some hemp bricks there, but ultimately the various technologies, building technologies that hemp makes available is is a massive shift from what our informal settlements are built from today. This is a cheap building material that is fully insulating with an R value of 2 per 2 centimeters. That's extraordinary. So, such a cheap building material can really change the lives of thousands of South Africans. If we perhaps introduce policy to mandate licensed farms to produce these building materials as part of a community or outreach or a community program to donate those materials back to the communities in which they operate. And then also government should recognize and stimulate supporting industries. Just for the industries mentioned on this page, lime mines and kelp farms or sulfur farms, testing laboratories, those businesses will be required to support the cannabis industry. And without investment, we may run into similar situations as our cousins in Eswatini, that ultimately, there aren't enough testing laboratories to facilitate their burgeoning industry, and this is leading to, difficulty exporting their product out of the country. Investment in these areas would be critical, and then also, smaller initiatives such as engagement with the cooperatives to stimulate more organic products. The supply chain, I think, for organic inputs at this point is one of the largest challenges. In that, the kelp we used for our proof of concept is reasonably inexpensive, but because it is for small scale or perhaps a small proof of concept, but the transport costs associated with bringing that product up from our coast to the major center was prohibitive. If government can somehow through a tax incentive perhaps incentivize farm cooperatives to stock more of those key organic inputs, it would leave us in a better position to ultimately switch the mindset away from the expensive imported chemical inputs and towards a more sustainable, holistic, long-term view. Guys, that ultimately concludes my presentation for today. I haven't seen any questions as yet. Right. Everyone, then thank you so much for attending. I see. Unfortunately, I am not part of the F19 Food Security Group, the C19 Food Security Group, but I'd love to get more information and to understand what it's all about. Thank you for listening, everyone. I hope some of it was thought-inspiring, and we'll chat again soon. Goodbye.